The sound of gravel crunching beneath heavy tires had become all too familiar. Every week, sometimes twice, the black man named Elijah would step out onto his ranch porch and see the same sight. His mailbox, twisted and crumpled, lying face down in the dirt. At first, he thought it was some random act of vandalism, teenagers testing their courage with reckless joyrides. But after the third, the fourth, and the fifth time, the pattern became undeniable. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. And worse, it was coming from the very people who were supposed to uphold the law. The so-called HOA cops, self-appointed. Enforcers hired by the Homeowners Association had taken it upon themselves to patrol the area as if it were their personal kingdom. They were not real officers, but they dressed like them, spoke like them, and acted with an arrogance that made many in the neighborhood bow their heads in silent frustration. Elijah, however, was not a man built to bow. His ranch sat proudly on the edge of the community, a modest but beautiful spread of land that had been in his family for generations. His father had laid the first wooden post of that ranch. His mother had planted the oak tree that now shaded its front yard, and Elijah had carried their legacy forward with pride. Every blade of grass on that land carried a story of resilience. But that mailbox, that small, ordinary structure, had become a battlefield. Neighbors whispered that the HOA patrols had targeted Elijah because he was one of the few black landowners in the area. His independence, his refusal to fall in line, and his unwillingness to bend to their intimidation made him a problem in their eyes. When Elijah spoke at HOA meetings, he spoke with the sharpness of truth. He questioned their misuse of fees, their selective enforcement of rules, and their habit of overlooking certain violations. When the offenders were well connected, they didn't like being challenged, especially by him, and so the harassment began. The first time it happened, Elijah shrugged it off. He went to the hardware store, bought a new mailbox, and set it in the ground. The second time, he felt irritation boil in his chest. By the third, it was no longer irritation, it was insult. Each time they crushed his mailbox, they weren't just destroying a piece of metal. They were sending a message. They wanted him to feel small, unwanted, invisible. But Elijah had never been invisible a day in his life. He remembered the words of his grandfather, who had lived through far harder times. Dignity is not given. It is defended. They may try to strip it from you, but only you decide whether they succeed. So Elijah decided he wouldn't let them succeed. The turning point came on a quiet Saturday morning. Elijah was mending a fence at the edge of his property when he heard the roar of an engine. He turned just in time to see the HOA cruiser, painted to mimic real police vehicles, swerving toward his mailbox like it was part of some cruel sport. The sound of metal crunching echoed across the field as the patrolman laughed and sped off, leaving dust in the air and fury in Elijah's chest. He walked slowly to the wreckage, picked up the bent steel, and held it in his hands. The laughter still rang in his ears. He could almost hear the message beneath it. We own this road. We own this neighborhood, and you'll never stand against us. But what they didn't realize was that Elijah was already standing. That night, he sat at his kitchen table with a notepad, sketching designs, his mind sharper than ever. He thought about every box he'd replaced, every dollar wasted, every insult swallowed. And then, with the precision of a craftsman and the heart of a warrior, he began to plan. If they wanted to keep coming for his mailbox, they would meet one they never saw coming. Days turned into nights as Elijah worked in his shed. Sparks flew from the welder. Sweat ran down his brow. He used steel thicker than anything found in a store, reinforced with concrete poured deep into the ground. This was no ordinary mailbox. This was a fortress disguised in plain sight. From the road, it looked simple, even humble, but inside it carried the weight of his determination, the strength of his ancestors, and the resolve of a man who refused to be broken. When he finally planted it in the ground, the earth seemed to accept it like an oath. Elijah dusted his hands, stood back, and whispered, "Try me now." The trap was set, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. It was not violence Elijah wanted. It was dignity. He wanted them to understand that his land, his family's legacy, and his pride were not toys to be crushed beneath their tires. And sure enough, they came. One humid evening, the sound of engines returned. 2 HOA patrol cars rolled down the gravel road, their lights flashing even though no emergency called for them. Elijah, standing on his porch, knew what was about to happen. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained calm. He didn't hide. He didn't flinch. He simply folded his arms and waited. The lead car swerved, just like before, aiming for the mailbox with reckless arrogance. Tires screeched. Metal met immovable steel, and in an instant, the patrol car's front end crumpled like paper against Elijah's creation. The sound was deafening. The vehicle shuddered to a stop, steam rising from its hood. Elijah didn't move. He didn't need to. The mailbox stood tall, untouched, unbent, unbroken, like him. The silence that followed was heavy. The second patrol car skidded to a stop behind the wreck, its driver frozen in disbelief. And Elijah, with the dignity of a man who had endured too much for too long, simply turned and walked back inside his house. He had made his statement. But what Elijah didn't know was that this single act would ignite a firestorm, one that would test not only his resolve but the very soul of the community. The wreck of the patrol car sat in front of Elijah's property like a monument to arrogance. Its headlights flickered weakly, steam pouring from the hood as oil bled into the gravel. The two HOA patrolmen stood outside, stunned into silence, their smug grins erased. They had expected another laugh, another easy destruction of Elijah's mailbox. Instead, they found themselves face to face with the truth. The man they had tried to humiliate had outsmarted them. Elijah, inside his house, did not celebrate. He simply sat at the kitchen table, pouring himself a glass of water, his face unreadable. To him, it was not about revenge. It was about a line drawn in the sand, a quiet declaration. You will not break me. But for the HOA patrols, the humiliation burned hotter than fire. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. By morning, whispers filled the air. Elijah's mailbox destroyed their car. He made it out of steel. They tried to play with him, and now look what happened. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting. They didn't like Elijah before. Now they despised him. Not because he had broken any rule, but because he had revealed their weakness. These men lived on power, on the illusion of authority. To be mocked, to be laughed at, that was something they could not stand. Within days, Elijah received his first official letter. The HOA accused him of violating community design standards with an unapproved structure on his property. They claimed the mailbox was unsafe, unsightly, and not in compliance with neighborhood aesthetics. Elijah read the letter slowly, shaking his head with a faint smile. For years, they had ignored actual violations, untrimmed lawns, broken fences, unsanctioned construction, because the offenders were connected. But now, suddenly, they had found their outrage. Elijah knew this was not about a mailbox. It was about power. Instead of tearing it down, he did something unexpected. He wrote back. His letter was professional, respectful, but unflinching. He reminded them that his mailbox stood well within county codes, built strong for safety and durability. He reminded them that their patrol had destroyed his property multiple times, yet no restitution had ever been offered. And he closed with words that carried the weight of generations. This land has stood with my family for decades. I will not be bullied off it. Respectfully, Elijah Carter. The HOA board was furious. They sent inspectors, they issued fines. They even tried to involve the sheriff's office. But the sheriff, after inspecting the mailbox himself, shrugged and said, "It's legal." Stronger than most? Sure, but legal. That single word, legal, was Elijah's shield. Yet the harassment did not end. Patrol cars now parked across from his property, engines idling, their presence heavy like storm clouds. At night, Elijah sometimes heard footsteps near his fence line. Laughter carried on the wind. They wanted him nervous, wanted him broken, but Elijah was no stranger to intimidation. As a younger man, he had faced worse in uniform, serving his country abroad. He had been trained to hold the line when others faltered, and here on his own soil he would do the same. Still, the toll was real. Neighbors avoided him, afraid of being caught in the crossfire. Some whispered encouragement quietly, "Keep standing strong. Elijah, we see you." But none dared speak it aloud. Loneliness pressed against him like a shadow, yet pride kept him steady. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the ranch in gold, Elijah's sister Maya came to visit. She saw the patrol cars parked outside and frowned. "They're not going to stop," she said softly, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. "You embarrassed them, and men like that, they only know how to double down." "I didn't embarrass them," Elijah replied. "They embarrassed themselves. I just stopped pretending I didn't see it." Maya studied him, her eyes filled with both admiration and worry. "You're strong, Eli, but strength comes with a cost. I don't want to see you swallowed up by their hate." Her words lingered long after she left. Elijah stared at the oak tree outside, its branches swaying in the breeze. His mother's tree. It had stood through storms, through droughts, through every season imaginable, and yet it still grew, still reached for the sky. Elijah whispered to himself, "If that tree can stand, so can I." The escalation reached a breaking point one stormy night. Rain pelted the roof, thunder rattled the windows, and lightning split the sky. Elijah sat awake, listening to the storm when he heard it, the low rumble of engines, louder than usual. He peered out the window and saw not one, not two, but 4 HOA patrol cars lined up on the road. Their headlights pierced the rain, casting long shadows across his yard. A chill ran through Elijah's spine, but his face remained calm. He opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, rain soaking his clothes instantly. He stood tall, arms crossed, staring down at the glowing headlights. The cars revved their engines in unison, their tires spinning mud. For a moment, Elijah thought they might try something worse than before. But then, as if in some twisted show of force, they drove away, one after the other, engines roaring into the distance. It was intimidation, pure and simple, a reminder that the battle wasn't over. Elijah stood in the rain long after they left, his jaw tight, his heart heavy. He knew this was no longer just about a mailbox. It was about a man's right to stand on his land without fear. It was about dignity, justice, and the quiet war so many like him had fought in silence. The following morning, Elijah made a decision. He would not remain silent. He began documenting everything, the patrols, the letters, the harassment. He spoke to local reporters, telling his story not with bitterness, but with clarity. "This isn't about me," he said. "This is about every person who's been told they don't belong. Every voice they've tried to silence. My mailbox is just a symbol. The real fight is for dignity." The story spread. First, it reached nearby towns. Then local news stations picked it up. Soon, Elijah's quiet stand had become something bigger. People who had never met him sent letters of support. Civil rights groups began asking questions about the HOA's practices, and the patrolmen who once laughed now found themselves at the center of a storm they could not control. But with attention came greater danger. The HOA board, now cornered and angry, plotted their next move. They had tried humiliation, intimidation, and legal threats. None of it had worked. Now, desperate to regain control, they prepared to strike harder. Elijah could feel it coming. The storm outside had passed, but another storm, one built of pride, power, and injustice, was gathering on the horizon. And he knew, deep down, that the real test of his strength was only just beginning. The pressure mounted like a vice. Elijah's name was now in the papers, his story circulating across neighborhoods, towns, and digital feeds. Strangers reached out with solidarity, some recounting their own battles against prejudice and power-drunk associations. His stand had become symbolic, but with every show of support, the HOA board dug in deeper. Their pride was wounded and they wanted revenge. The letters escalated into threats of foreclosure, claims that Elijah was in violation of community harmony, clauses buried deep in obscure bylaws. They demanded thousands in fines, hoping financial pressure would succeed where intimidation had failed. Elijah read each letter carefully, placed it in a folder, and added it to his growing case file. He refused to be baited into anger. Instead, he prepared with the discipline of a soldier gathering evidence for a long campaign. But harassment was not only on paper. Late one night, Elijah awoke to the sound of shattering glass. His heart pounded as he rushed to the living room to find a rock lying in shards beside his window. No one was outside, only the whisper of wind through the trees. Elijah stood silently for a long time, the rock heavy in his palm. The message was clear: we're watching. We're not done. The next day, Elijah called a community meeting, not under the HOA banner, but on his ranch. He invited neighbors, friends, and even those who had once avoided him out of fear. At first, only a handful showed. But word spread, and soon dozens gathered beneath the shade of his mother's oak tree. Elijah stood before them, his voice steady but filled with fire. "They think this is about a mailbox," he began, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. "But you and I know better. This is about respect. This is about whether a man, a family, a community can be bullied into silence. They've run over my mailbox, they've threatened my home, but what they really want to crush is dignity. And if I let them succeed, then every one of us is at risk." The crowd murmured, heads nodding, courage stirring. For years, Many had quietly endured the HOA's selective punishments, their heavy-handed patrols, their abuse of power. Elijah's stand had given them something they hadn't felt in a long time: permission to speak, to resist. Among the crowd was a local reporter, notebook in hand, capturing every word. That evening, Elijah's speech aired on the nightly news, his voice echoing across living rooms. And soon attorneys began to call, civil rights lawyers, property advocates, people willing to stand with him in court. What began as a private battle had become a public reckoning. The HOA board, sensing the walls closing in, made one last attempt to break him. On a sweltering afternoon, their patrol cars returned 3 in a row, engines growling like predators circling prey. This time they didn't swerve at the mailbox. They parked directly in front of Elijah's property, blocking the road, lights flashing. Elijah stepped out onto his porch, shoulders squared, his calm demeanor unshaken. The patrolmen approached, their boots crunching on gravel. One of them, red-faced with anger, shouted, "You think you can embarrass us? You think you can make us look weak?" Elijah met his glare, his voice low but commanding. "You did that all on your own. All I did was stand." For a tense moment, it felt like the air itself held its breath. The patrolmen shifted, uncertain, their show of dominance unraveling under the weight of Elijah's composure. And then, before the standoff could erupt further, headlights appeared in the distance. Dozens of cars, neighbors, supporters, even reporters were arriving, drawn by word of what was happening. The patrolmen, realizing the eyes of the community were upon them, faltered. One by one, they retreated to their vehicles. Engines roared, tires spun, and within moments, they were gone. Elijah remained on his porch, unmoved, his mailbox standing tall beside him, a silent sentinel of resilience. The next weeks brought the final turning point. With mounting public pressure, lawsuits were filed. County officials launched investigations into the HOA's conduct, uncovering years of financial mismanagement, selective enforcement, and harassment. The so-called HOA cops were exposed as nothing more than hired enforcers with no legal authority, their contracts terminated. One by one, board members resigned under scrutiny, their arrogance collapsing beneath the weight of truth. And Elijah, he never raised his voice in victory, never gloated. Instead, he continued to care for his ranch, tending the land his father had built, the oak tree his mother had planted. His mailbox still stood, stronger than ever, not just as a place to receive letters, but as a symbol of what happens when dignity is defended. One quiet morning, Elijah sat on his porch sipping coffee when his sister Maya returned. She smiled at the sight of the mailbox, still gleaming in the sun, unbroken. "You did it, Eli," she said softly. "You stood when most would have given up." Elijah shook his head, a faint smile crossing his lips. "No, we did it. That mailbox wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who's been told they don't belong. It was for every voice that's been silenced. It was for every ancestor who refused to bow." Maya sat beside him, and together they watched the morning unfold, the ranch alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves. Peace at last had returned. But more than peace, dignity had triumphed. And though Elijah never sought to be a hero, his story rippled outward, reminding all who heard it that strength is not always loud, that resistance is not always violent, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but on porches beside oak trees and in the shadow of a mailbox that refused to fall.